Hello, I hope you're well. Welcome or welcome back to my channel and welcome to today's video, which is my November wrap-up. Now, November didn't go exactly to plan, like at all. Nonfiction November is a big deal for me. It's something I look forward to every year, and I always create these really ambitious TBRs for it. And at the end of the day, I just didn't end up reading as much nonfiction as I would have hoped or liked. Instead, most of my energy was on my Outlander project for 2021. So I ended up reading 2 Outlander books in November, which, if you tally up the pages, is probably something like 26 or 2,700 pages just between those 2 books alone. So it wasn't that I wasn't reading, it's just that my reading was a little bit distracted from Nonfiction November. But there is another November in the future, so hopefully I do better than it is what it is. But why don't we start talking about the books? I will put a timestamp where I start talking about fiction in case you're not interested in the nonfiction, but why don't we dive into those Nonfiction November reads right now. So we're gonna start off with 2 nonfiction books that I started reading in November, but I ultimately did not finish, and I'm not DNFing them, and you'll see why, but these are 2 books that I started and did not manage to complete in November. So the first book that I want to talk about is A Swim in a Pond in the Rain by George Saunders, with a title that trips me up every single time I go to say it. I didn't get very far in this. I only read 1 of the 7 sections, but I already expect this to be a 5-star read for me because I was absolutely floored. So I do intend to continue reading this in December. But George Saunders is an MFA professor. He teaches this class at, I think it's Syracuse, on short stories, but he does this by looking at short stories written by the Russian literary giants who my subscribers know I certainly have a soft spot for. So he's taken what would be like an entire semester and tried to truncate it into 7 sections, exploring 7 different short stories and the art of crafting a short story. And it was so fascinating to me. So the first short story that I read was actually one by Anton Chekhov, and he uses this method which is very conversational, where you read a page of the short story and then George Saunders, in this way that makes you feel like he's in the room, starts asking you these questions about like, what have you learned in this last page that you've read, and makes you really think critically, which teaches you what you need in a short story as a writer in order to make it move and to make it impactful, but also as a reader just makes you think more critically about the different sort of devices and the pacing and the way that a plot in a short story is sort of distilled. And it was just so interesting. So I do want to continue reading this. I think what I might actually do is use this for the Dasher prompt in the Reindeer Readathon, switch this out for the novella I'd chosen, because that prompt you could read a short story collection, or a novella, and maybe I'll use one of the short stories that I haven't gotten to yet for that prompt, which hopefully isn't breaking any sort of rules. But I do think that's the way I'm going to go, and hopefully I can make a little bit of a dent on it, this book, this weekend, because it's just good. I'm expecting this to be 5 stars, because I also think that each chapter is a different like technique that he teaches you. So it should be quite the education, and I am here for it. The next book is another one that I did not finish, and that is Fascism by Madeleine Albright. As you can see, I do have a physical copy here, but I decided to listen to this as an audiobook because Madeleine Albright herself narrates it, which I think is always a nice touch with certain books. So I thought it would be a good time, or as good a time as it can get when you're talking about fascism. But I did get pretty far. I got about 40% into the audiobook when I realized that I wasn't really processing it in a way that I thought was particularly helpful. I think honestly I just had too much going on at once. I was trying to read this, which is not a light subject. I was reading a very large Outlander book at the same time, and I was also trying to read the George Saunders book that I literally just spoke about, and it was just too much. So I didn't end up feeling like I was getting what I should out of this book. I thought it was interesting, but I do think that I could take a lot more out of it. And so when I probably read it, I will start from the very beginning again, and I will likely read it as a physical copy because I do think that this particular type of book does better for me in that format. But it was really interesting looking at her exploration thus far of Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin, and looking at that history of their rise to power, as well as having the lens of her having been a child growing up in war-torn Europe. So I do think that this will be really interesting once I do sit down to it and give it my undivided attention. Unfortunately, that wasn't what I was doing originally. So this is a book that I'm going to return to later. It's not a complete DNF, it's just I'm going to put it back on the shelf and I'll get back to it at a later date. Okay, moving right along to nonfiction books that I actually managed to finish in Nonfiction November. I know that it's a novel concept for everyone, but I want to start off by talking about In the Heart of the Sea by Nathaniel Philbrick, which I realized once I started reading it that I had actually seen like a somewhat mediocre film adaptation starring Chris Hemsworth with a brief appearance by Catelyn Stark herself, Michelle Fairley. But essentially this is the story of the Essex which inspired Herman Melville to write Moby Dick. It is about a whaling ship that is sunk by a whale. So these men depart from Nantucket to go on this like 2.5 year voyage to whale, and on this trip they run across a whale that isn't going to go down gently and actually sinks the ship. And from a series of sort of boneheaded decisions by those in charge, they end up being adrift far from civilization and land for an inordinate amount of time. And in order to survive, some of the shipwrecked men end up actually eating their shipmates. So this is a book that talks about cannibalism, so it's definitely not going to be for everyone. I will say though that it does not go into like the gory details, and it's not like gratuitous, but it's certainly a kind of dark element to this that is not going to be to everyone's taste, which is an awful pun. I apologize. But I didn't hate it. I didn't love this book though, so I ended up giving it 3 stars. I thought that there was a lot of interesting information about whaling and the voyage and just like nautical everything in general and sort of the culture in Nantucket and the like. But I didn't really feel anything for the men of the Essex and what they were actually going through. Like, there always felt like there was some wall or something that was keeping me at arm's length from them. And considering the harrowing story and considering everything that they went through, I felt like I should have had some sort of like emotional response. I should have felt some sort of sympathy or disgust or I don't know, just something, and it just didn't happen. Like, it was very, very bizarre to me that I didn't connect in the way that I normally do with the individuals. I also think, too, that this book really throws you, like, headlong into sort of the nautical terminology, which it doesn't give you much room if you're not someone who knows the terms to, like, quickly pick them up. I don't feel like it did a great job of, like, making it easier for an individual to understand if they were not experienced, like, sailors or the like, which I understand, like, some of that work needs to be done by the readers. That is sometimes part of the process, and I do understand that, but I feel like it was just a little bit heavy-handed on these terms, and it probably could have done a better job at making the entire story a little bit more accessible. So those were my feelings about it. I didn't hate it, as I said, I just didn't love it. I feel like this is one of these books that's probably going to be pretty forgettable for me, even though the story is kind of fantastic and up there with, like, The Donner Party, which is also another story of cannibalism and survival. So, I don't know. This book, like I said, I probably will forget the majority of what I read in this in a month or two. The next book is Manderley Forever by Tatiana de Rosnay, which I listened to as an audiobook, and it is the biography of Daphne du Maurier. And Daphne du Maurier is an author that I love reading. Rebecca is one of my favorite books of all time. I read My Cousin Rachel earlier this year and really enjoyed it. I'm trying to read Jamaica in during December, and I just realized when I discovered this biography that I know next to nothing about Daphne du Maurier herself. So I was really, really interested in the biography. And it turns out that she is a truly fascinating woman. She is the daughter of a famous British actor. She was related to the Llewellyns. They were cousins of hers, and the Llewellyns are the children that J.M. Barrie immortalized, basically, as Peter Pan. So she has connections to that. And she ends up being this sort of nonconformist as far as, like, the social mores of the time in a lot of ways. It is believed that she had romantic relationships with other women, including Ellen Doubleday of the publishing house, and also Gertrude Lawrence, the actress. She kind of had this reclusive way about her, but she was also really sort of an obsessive personality, and she had this interesting way of, like, creating an alter ego for herself. This, like, a la Sasha Fierce situation where she creates Eric Avon, and supposedly, like, Daphne du Maurier could differentiate which books were inspired by the more masculine alter ego or influenced by Eric Avon versus those that had the more feminine Daphne du Maurier, I guess, to blame for the works. So it was really interesting because Daphne du Maurier's life is particularly interesting. However, I do feel like this biography had a couple of flaws, so I ended up giving it a 3.75. Since I am using the story graph now, I figured I should start getting used to these, like, fractional and decimal sort of ratings. But anyway, that's a digression. There were a couple things that bothered me. I think when the book was focused primarily on fact or based on her journals or, like, her interviews, which she didn't give many of, or her letters, or based on people who actually knew her and could speak to what was going on, it was really strong. Like, when it was based in fact, it was really strong. But there was this way that the author was kind of making assumptions or conjecture about what Daphne du Maurier must have been thinking or why she thought that way, which aren't based on fact necessarily, and that kind of bothered me, and I don't think it necessarily had a place in a biography. So that was my main thing, my main quibble, and also the fact that kind of at the beginning there's a lot of emphasis on the fact that Tatiana de Rosnay is basically visiting these important places in Daphne du Maurier's life, almost in this way that kind of, sort of, is memoir-esque, but not quite. But I feel like that's very prevalent at the beginning of the book, and then peters out and doesn't take up as much, like, time or paging later on in the book, so it ends up kind of feeling like this thing that didn't need to happen. To be quite honest, I think that if this had been a straightforward biography, it would have been a much higher rating for me. Or if Tatiana de Rosnay had written it more as like a biographical novel, it probably would have been a higher rating. Because in that case, you can make all the conjecture you want because it's fiction. So I just think the biographical novel probably would have played more to the author's strengths than writing as a biography, and so it ended up not being quite my favorite thing, and probably 3.75 is a little bit generous, but I was genuinely fascinated by Daphne du Maurier's life, so that's why. And the last book that I read for Nonfiction November was No Man's Land by Wendy Moore, which was a 5-star prediction for me, and it wasn't quite 5 stars, but it was pretty darn close. It was 4.5 stars, and I really enjoyed this. This made the, like, little pre-med student part of me, like, so happy. It was so inspirational. It is about these 2 suffragette doctors, Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson, who end up running a hospital that treats the soldiers in World War I that is almost exclusively staffed by women. They are the doctors, the surgeons, the anesthesiologists, the orderlies, the nurses, the cooks, everything. Like, it is a true feminist icon, and I had never heard of these women before. And also Flora and Louisa are not only partners professionally, but they are partners in life. So there is this LGBTQ plus aspect of the story as well. It was just so fascinating because, yes, Flora and Louisa are kind of at the epicenter of all of this. They are the fearless leaders, and they really create that like thread that goes through the entire book. But this is as much a story about them as it is about the women who are working with them at Endell Street in London, and it was just so fascinating because both Louisa and Flora aren't just suffragettes in name. Like, one of them treated Emmeline Pankhurst after her hunger strikes. The other one had actually been in jail for her sort of suffragette activity. So there is a lot of that feminist, like, yes she can sort of attitude here, and it's just so inspiring because not only are these women who are trying to get the right to vote for other women, but they are really trying to break down barriers, break the glass ceiling as it were, to let women actually practice medicine, because while they could go to medical school, that was an uphill battle, but also, like, being able to find actual, like, jobs at hospitals was very difficult, and a lot of the times they ended up only working in situations where they were taking care of women and children and maybe the poor. So it was kind of shocking that these women were taking care of soldiers who were coming directly from the front with these hideous, hideous wounds. And I really, really enjoyed it because not only was it the story of these women and what they were doing at the hospital, but you got a lot of history of sort of the war itself, the society at the time, and also medical history, which is very much my jam. I do really love it. The only reason that I didn't give it 5 stars is because I do think that there's a little bit of redundancy here, because it also addresses and talks about the different women who were working for Flora and Louisa and tells their stories. And a lot of the times, the stories they were telling were very similar about the struggles that these women faced in order to become doctors and to practice. And so I didn't think that you necessarily needed as many of those stories as were included in the book. So as I said, it did feel a little redundant, but oh my word, the ending of this book, the only thing that I can think of that's comparable would be like Radium Girls and that sort of rage or anger at injustice, because I definitely felt that, but I also, like, there was something about it that was just, it hit me in the feels. I definitely shed a couple of tears. But I really, really enjoyed this. If you're interested in World War I or medical history or anything sort of on feminism and the suffrage movement, you would probably enjoy this. And now we're moving on to the fiction books that I read in November, which are exclusively Outlander books. So taking a page out of Noelle's book and holding them this way, I feel like my arm is going to kill me in a moment. But I read book 6 and book 7 in Outlander, so A Breath of Snow and Ashes, and it would be helpful if that was facing the right way, Brittany, An Echo in the Bone. And I had kind of different feelings about both of these books. They are quite large, and this is not the easiest thing to hold. But I ended up giving the 6th book, A Breath of Snow and Ashes, 4.5 stars, and I ended up giving the 7th book 3.75 stars. So with A Breath of Snow and Ashes, which I believe is the longest book in the series to date, I believe, was one of these books that was just filled with action from like page 1. There was so much going on here all the time, which I feel like is a bit different from quite a few of the Outlander books, which tend to kind of meander a little bit. The beginnings can be slow, or if the beginning is intense, the middle can be very slow. Like, usually the pacing kind of up and down. But this was really filled with action, and I'm not going to try to like spoil the plot or give away too much. If you want that information, there is a reading vlog up on it. But this kind of captured the like adventurous elements of Outlander. There were kidnappings, there were mysterious deaths, there were births, there were these plot twists and these secrets about supporting characters that came to light. There was danger, there was just a lot going on, and it was really enjoyable. So, do I think it needed to be as long as it was? Probably not, but it did cover like 3 to 4 years in Outlander time, so it is covering a lot of ground. It's just, I don't necessarily think that many books need to be quite as long as this one. Then for An Echo in the Bone, which was book 7 in the series, as I said, I gave it 3.75 stars, and that was just because I think this is a book that if you're really into like the American Revolution or like American history, you might enjoy, but I feel like a lot of this book was just too military for me, if that makes sense, because you're literally in the thick of the American Revolution, and Jamie and Claire are with the troops, and Jamie is a colonel, and there's like Fort Ticonderoga and all of this stuff that is happening, all these battles and skirmishes and military movements of troops, and just a lot of stuff that doesn't particularly do it for me generally, like even with these characters. So that was just a little bit heavy on that stuff for me, but also this book introduces a lot of different like POVs. So we suddenly have William, who is Jamie's son. His POV starts appearing. You're also with Roger and Brianna in some places. You're with Jamie and Claire. You're like, there are just a lot of POVs here. And I felt like a good chunk of the book you spent away from Jamie and Claire, which I'm not reading the Outlander series to read about other people. I appreciate really well-developed supporting characters, but my main squeezes, the main reason I am reading this book is for Jamie and Claire. So I ended up feeling like I just didn't spend as much time with them as I would have liked. I don't know percentage-wise how much of the book you're not with Jamie and Claire, but it felt like a lot to me at the time of reading it. But I will say, though, that I ended up giving it the, like, 0.75 because this book had me in tears, ugly sobbing, for a good portion of the book. So I still felt the emotional connection that I really love in books. It's just this one wasn't necessarily for me. So it was okay. It wasn't bad. It wasn't great. It's still higher than my least favorite book in the series, which I believe was The Fiery Cross, which I gave 3 stars to. So it didn't do too badly. It's nearly 4 stars. But yeah, so, ow, that really hurt my arm. So yeah, those were the 2 fiction books that I read in November. So yeah, November was a bit of a weird month. I ended up reading 5 books total, 3 nonfiction, 2 fiction, and then I had 2 other books that I started but didn't manage to finish in November. So it was a bit of a weird month, but you win some, you lose some. It wasn't a complete bust for nonfiction November. I just fully anticipated that I would have read like 6, 7, 8 nonfiction books this month. So, what you gonna do? But anyway, I do hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe because it helps this little channel grow, and it means the world to me. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!